in silico and the field investigations. Okay, so I think from now on, I'll pass the microphone to Professor Krajang, okay, who will be the chair person of this program, please.
Good afternoon, all committee and on audience. Thank you, Professor Sutat, for inviting me to this thesis defense for Jan Cry. So he will have about 45 minutes for his presentation, and then will be a question from the audience, and then the committee will ask the question and then evaluation him. So if you are ready, please, Jan, so you can present your thesis.
Okay, Jan?
Yes.
Am I clear? Can I be clear? Am I heard clear?
Yes.
Let me see. Okay. So can we start? So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Clyde. So as Jan said, I'm a PhD student in tropical medicine, and welcome to my defense. So my research revolves around benzimidazole resistance, specifically in hookworms, and we have used some different methodologies wherein we were able to uncover some interesting things with regards to that issue, which is benzimidazole resistance. So for the content of this presentation, so essentially it follows my thesis book, or my manuscript, as we call it in the Philippines, wherein we divided several results into several chapters, and that is what we will be discussing today. So we start at background, study 1, 2, 3, 4, then we'll end with some concluding remarks. So to start, what are benzimidazoles? So why are we discussing this? But first, I think we need to understand what's behind the drug. Why is it a good antihelmintic drug? So from a chemical standpoint, structural standpoint, benzimidazoles are fused benzene ring. So it's this fused benzene and imidazoline ring. So in the imidazole part, we have an amine group, several amine groups, which makes it a bit polar, but not really. But the point is that this core structure can be modified in several ways, which makes it a very good, very diverse type of antihelmintic drug. So how does it work? So benzimidazoles, like albendazole or mebendazole, they bind with the beta-tubulin protein. So the beta-tubulin protein binds with the alpha-tubulin protein to form the tubulin dimer. And the tubulin dimer is the building block of microtubules. So cell physiology, microtubules are very important for structure and other cellular functions. A fun way of looking at beta-tubulin protein is imagining it like a donut, wherein in the center there is a hole, and that corresponds to the binding site of the drug. So the colchicine binding site is basically in the center of the drug. Now, when the benzimidazole drug binds with the beta-tubulin protein, it inhibits or disrupts the microtubule formation, because the binding of the drug inhibits the dimerization and therefore polymerization of the microtubule. And that leads to parasite killing through microtubule disruption of glucose uptake, and reduced egg viability. As I have said, benzimidazole drugs they're very, very good, very, very widely used antihelmintic drugs. I would know, as a veterinarian, it's basically impossible to find an animal species that does not use benzimidazole drugs. So it's broad spectrum, including humans. Now, what's the most common use among humans? So from the public health perspective, we use benzimidazoles, particularly albendazole and mebendazole, for the treatment and control of soil-transmitted helminths. So these include ascaris, trichuris, and hookworms. So we do this by treating large group of population, particularly at-risk groups, so children, women of reproductive age, and immunocompromised population. Now, when we do this regularly, so we may do it once a year if the prevalence is less than 50, or twice a year if the prevalence is more than 50. But the point is, you repeat it until such time that you achieve a goal. Now, for the WHO, the goal is to reduce infection prevalence to less than 20%, and the prevalence of medium to high intensity infection to less than 2%. As I've said, we need to, when we do MDA against soil-transmitted helminths, we do it again and again and again for long periods of time. And what happens there is you put positive selective pressure. So that results in the worm trying to survive. It will try to find a way to survive the treatment. Again, you do it repeatedly, positive selective pressure repeatedly, you will eventually end up with resistant worms. The question is, how does resistance happen? So there are a lot of literature, specifically from veterinary medicine, from the animal side of things, that resistance to benzimidazole drugs occur when certain mutations happen. So particularly SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphism, so single base changes that results in amino acid substitution, so amino acid change. So among these changes that are commonly used, or canonical, as they say, is F167Y. So phenylalanine becomes tyrosine at position 167 and position 200 of the beta-tubulin protein. And in 198, where glutamic acid becomes alanine, so E198A. So we will discuss later on about the biochemistry of this one, but the point for now is that these mutations are the ones causing resistance. So the question, one question that was raised to me early in the part of my PhD is that, is there any proof that these mutations actually cause resistance? And indeed, there are. So there are already a lot of studies, including this one by Dilks et al., wherein they gene edited the C. elegans to contain the aforementioned 3 mutations. And as you can see, in panels B and D, they were able to survive exposure to benzimidazole drugs. Therefore, these mutations are able to produce resistance in worms that have them. From the field, you also have results from Haemonchus contortus, which is a parasite or a worm of goats and sheep. And as you can see here, those from the population that are resistant to fenbendazoles or a benzimidazole drug, diversity indices is particularly high in chromosome 1. And zooming in on chromosome 1, the locus that is particularly diversified is the beta-tubulin isotype 1 gene. Therefore, indicating that resistance in the population that they studied is linked to changes, or at least mutation, in the beta-tubulin gene. Now, going back to human parasites, so soil-transmitted helminths, these mutations that caused resistance have been reported in many parts of the world. Among the very first papers that I did in my PhD study, or I wrote, we were able to identify that these mutations have pretty much occurred in Central and South America, Africa, and other regions. But surprisingly, no reports in Asia. I call that surprising because in Asia, one-third of the world infection of STH is occurring in our region. So almost all of the countries have programs, but none of them, there are no reports of resistance occurrence. But going back to hookworms, since it is my parasite of interest, there is already a growing body of evidence of the emergence of these mutations that cause resistance. So there seems to be a growth of number of publication or number of interest with regards to this topic. Hence, we selected it as the core reason of my PhD research. So for my research, I actually have 3 main research questions. So first, we wanted to know what are the BC resistance, what are the resistance associated with mutations associated with resistance among hookworms. What would be the consequence of this resistance or in silico effects of these mutations? And do these mutations occur in Southeast Asia? And from that 3 research questions, our research objectives simply follows. So I don't think I'm going to go deeper to that. And this is the conceptual framework, but then again, this is going to be too complex. So we'll go back to the 3 research questions, and we'll discuss them one by one with the different studies that is answering those research questions. So first research question. So what are these BZ resistance associated mutations? So to answer this, we'll go to study 1. So for my first study, so we conducted a systematic review. So we titled it BZ resistance associated mutation in the beta-tubulin gene of hookworms, a systematic review. So for this systematic review, we wanted to know 3 things. So we had 3 research questions. So first, what are the mutation? What were the SNPs associated with resistance? Where did they occur? So what's the geographic distribution? And what are the phenotypic effects, if reported, caused by these mutations? So for this review, we were able to search several databases. So we came up with more less than 400 hits, and we were able to narrow it down to 29 papers through a rigorous screening process. But first question, to answer the first question, what would be this mutation? So from the peer-reviewed literature, it has been reported that there are 7 SNP-induced amino acid substitutions. Substitution that is linked with BZ resistance in hookworms. So it occurs in 4 amino acid positions. So position 134, 167, 198, and 200. So in position 134, for instance, glutamine becomes histidine because of this mutation. And it has occurred in the dog hookworm, Ancylostoma caninum. And there's already proof of phenotypic resistance. So position 167, you have phenylalanine becoming tyrosine. And has been reported in dog hookworm and human hookworm. And yes, as I've shown earlier, there is already proof of phenotypic resistance. But for amino acid position 198, glutamic acid may become alanine, lysine, or valine. It occurs in different species of hookworm, and some of them have proof of resistance, some of them have not. They have just been reported. And for 200, phenylalanine becomes tyrosine or leucine. For geographical distribution, so the mutation at Q134H and F167Y, they occur primarily on dog hookworms from Canada and from the US, and human hookworms from Africa. For 198-200, they occur in Central and South America and Africa as well, but there are reports of them occurring in Australia and New Zealand. But going back to human hookworms, so public health significance, there seems to be not a clear link between occurrence of resistance and phenotypic resistance mutation and phenotypic resistance. So I highlight 3 papers here. So for instance, you have, in the first example, you have SNPs are occurring, but the egg reduction rate is good. So meaning there's no resistance. The drug is still working, even though the mutation is present. On the second example from Orr et al. In Ghana, the SNPs were found before and after drug treatment. So if these are for resistance, should be more occurring after the drug treatment. But for the last example, you also have a scenario wherein the SNPs are occurring pre and post treatment, but there's already resistance because the egg reduction rate is reduced, so less than 95%. So there seems to be a confusion, not a direct link with the occurrence of resistance, mutation and the occurrence of resistance. So that seems to be the question mark from this paper. So to end for this chapter, so we learned that there are 7 mutations in the beta-tubulin gene that is linked in hookworms that is linked to resistance. Some of them already have been confirmed to cause resistance. So there's already proof of phenotypic resistance. However, some of them are not, there's no like strict correlation with regards to occurrence of resistance and phenotypic resistance. So that seems to be the, as I've said, it seems to be like a mixed bag or a question mark. So the question is, what do we do with that? So from that paper, that's like the research gap that we highlighted from that paper. And we have published this systematic review last December 2024, a couple months ago, in Parasitology Research. Okay, so question number 2. So what are the effects, what are the resistance-associated in silico effects of this mutation? So from the previous systematic review, we identified 7 mutations, and there, as I've said, there is like a research gap of why some mutation occur, but there are no resistance. So how do we answer that research gap? So one method that I learned during my PhD is that you can use computational structural biology in silico methods, in other words, to look at how the drug will bind to the protein. And it works with beta-tubulin because beta-tubulin as a protein is structural. So there are no other function other than structure. So you can clearly see it using what the resistance effect would be clearly seen in silico methods. So that's what we did. So for a study, that is for chapter 2. So we titled it Unraveling the Mechanism of BZ Resistance in Hookworms, a Molecular Docking and Dynamic Study. So as the research question said, so we wanted to determine what's the effect of the mutations that we found. So what would be the effect on drug binding and binding behavior and efficacy? So first, we modeled the 3D structure of the crystal structure of the beta-tubulin protein. So we modeled the wild type, and we modeled it with the 7 mutations that we found using this model and validation, thereafter validation. And we bound, or we docked, molecular docking, we docked it with 4 drugs, so fenbendazole FBZ, albendazole ABC, oxbendazole OBZ, and bebendazole MBC. So those 4 drugs are the most common benzimidazole drugs used in animal and human. And we were able to measure the binding through binding affinity, or delta G. Next, we looked at the statics. So again, this is just the protein and the drug, so how the drug is interacting with the protein. And so we visualized the docking process. But molecular docking is only static, so it's like taking a picture, the drug and the protein. So it doesn't answer how what about the behavior of the binding between the complex between the protein and the drug. So we submitted it through molecular dynamics. So how does the protein interact with the drug through the duration of 100 nanoseconds? And we have some parameters here which I will expound on later. So I'll explain what this mean and how do they measure the binding between the protein and the drug. So first, again, we have a table here of the 7 mutations. You have 7 mutations and 4 drugs. And A, B, C, and D are 4 hookworm species. So dog hookworm, the A. caninum, A. ceylanicum, A. duodenale, and N. americanus. And you can clearly see that among the 7 mutations, there is a clear reduction when the Q134H and E198K mutation are occurring. So these two, across the different species of hookworm, across the different types of drugs, these 2 mutations tend to reduce the binding between the protein and the drug, indicating resistance. Okay, we move to the more complicated part, which is the molecular dynamics. So in molecular dynamics, we look at several parameters to assess whether or not the simulation is good, or the prediction is good. So RMSD, we look at root mean squared differentiation. The key word here is movement and stability, because when the RMSD value is very high, meaning the protein and the drug are moving very they're very much moving, and they are therefore unstable. But if it is like this, that they are quite similar with the wild type, meaning the binding is stable, or at least the structure of the complex is stable. For RMSF, we look at flexibility. So this is RMSF value over the residue. So you can clearly see which parts of the protein is changing in conformation. But then again, when you look at it, the flexible regions is quite similar compared to the wild type and the mutated one. And for SASA, which is solvent accessible surface area, so it simply just shows the surface area that is accessible to the solvent. So essentially what it shows is when the SASA is high, meaning the conformation of the protein is becoming different. So maybe it's opening up and allowing more surface area to contact with the solvent. But as you can see, the values are very, very quite similar. So in essence, the structure of the protein, the presence of this mutation does not significantly alter the structure of the protein. So very similar to the wild type. But when we look at how the protein interacts with the drug, there is a different result. As you can see here in binding free energy, so essentially it just measures the energy of the binding. So the more negative it is, the better, the stronger the binding. So you can clearly see you have two methods here, MMPBSA and MMGBSA. Those are just two methods of measuring it. And both of them are showing that when E198K and Q134H mutations are occurring, they reduce the binding energy. So they lessen so less negative, meaning less efficient binding, so indicating resistance. So the question is, how does this happen? Why is the occurrence of the mutation reducing binding energy? So we can look at the number of hydrogen bonds contacting between the drug and the protein. So you can see here in wild type, the number of hydrogen bonds is usually just two to three, mostly. But within the two mutations, it reduced to, for E198K, just 1. For Q134H, 2 to 3. So it's reduced from 2 to 3 to 1 to 2 or to 1. So that's the main reason there. But we'll look later on why this is happening. But first, for the discussion, I need to tell you that Q134H and E198K already has been proven to cause resistance, as you can see from these reports of Venkatesan and Dilks et al. So gene-edited C. elegans have the mutation and they are able to survive. They were able to survive exposure to benzimidazole drugs. Okay. So there's already proof that they cause resistance. The question is why? Why does it happen? So we need to look at the biochemistry, the biochemical components of the interaction, or what's happening from the biochemistry standpoint. So you can see here that when, for instance, for E198K, so if in the wild type, it's glutamic acid, so E198A, so the end of the R group of the glutamic acid is it's an acid, so it's COOH, carboxyl group. So it is able to interact with the amine group, which is positive, from the benzimidazole core. So it's able to form hydrogen bonds, as you can see here in our result. So that is why it's like 2 to 3. Number of hydrogen bonds, 2 to 3, because of this. And it is this interaction that basically it's the important interaction between the drug and the protein. Now, when you change glutamic acid to lysine because of the mutation, so E198K, it becomes K198. Lysine has a positive R group, and of the R group, so it's an amine. It's not able to bind to form. It's not able to form hydrogen bonds with the amine group of the benzimidazole drug. However, it can form pi-cation bonds, which are very much weaker than hydrogen bonds. That's why here the only hydrogen bond here is this. That's why it's 1. So lesser number of hydrogen bonds because of the changing of the biochemical structure and biochemical characteristic of the amino acid. Moreover, you also have a situation wherein because you change the protein, you change the amino acid, it is now able to form bonds with other amino acids neighboring it. So instead of binding to the drug, it's binding to the other amino acids around it. So for instance, lysine It's able to interact with phenylalanine because it is a aromatic ring, so pi-cation bonds, and it is able to form hydrogen bonds with, for example, the hydroxyl group of serine, which is nearby. For Q134H, the histidine at 134, it's able to form hydrogen bonds with the hydroxyl group of tyrosine at 50, which is, again, it's a neighbor amino acid, and other groups of the aromatic ring is able to form other pi interactions with neighboring amino acids. So in result, instead of binding to the drug, the mutant amino acid is binding in the surrounding amino acids of the protein itself, so self-binding. So here we unraveled, so therefore we found that these mutations cause resistance through several ways. So first, it reduced the binding energy, or it reduced the efficiency of binding between the protein and the drug. This happened because of the reduction of number of hydrogen bonds. Now, why is the hydrogen bonds reducing? So the biochemical changes of the mutation, so change in the R group, for instance, of the amino acid, of the mutant amino acid, result in weaker interaction. Moreover, there's also a scenario that we found that the mutant amino acid is not binding to the drug, but binding to itself, hence reducing the efficacy of the binding. So for that result, we were able to publish it March, I believe, this year, 2025, from the Journal of Genetic Engineering Biotechnology, and it's now Q1, just Q1 for this year. So we found that we unraveled the mystery of causing the resistance. But another question arose. So this mutation, because the beta-tubulin protein needs to bind with the alpha-tubulin protein to form the tubulin dimer, for it to be the building block of microtubule. So the question that we wanted to know, or we wanted to answer, was, does the mutation have any effect on this interaction? And to answer that, we developed a simple in silico experiment we titled BC resistance associated mutation improve the in silico dimerization of hookworm tubulin, an additional resistance mechanism, ? So as I have said, this is a very simple experiment, simple in silico experiment, where we predicted the structure of the alpha in the beta tubulin, but for the beta tubulin, we added the 7 mutation that we found from the previous systematic review. So we modeled it using AI, using AlphaFold, and of course we needed to validate it. But to determine the effects on the binding with the alpha in the beta tubulin, we did measured the binding energy and did some other measurements that would tell us whether or not the mutation will be affecting the binding with the alpha in the beta tubulin. And for this research, since we used an AI model to model the dimer, we compared the predicted structure, when we compared it to a crystal structure from PDB, from a mammalian tubulin structure from PDB, and we found that the AI model of the dimer is very similar, closely resembling the mammalian tubulin, which is very good. So that it simply shows that the AI model was good, and it was able to accurately predict the structure of the alpha in the beta tubulin. So going back to the question, is there an effect with regards to the binding of the alpha in the beta tubulin when the beta tubulin is mutated? And indeed there is. So for certain mutations, so the red line is for the wild type. So for certain mutations, there is an increase or decrease, but very much similar, negligible difference with regards to in relation to the wild type. However, there are 2 mutations that, one, the Q134H mutation, again, extremely, it significantly reduced the binding energy. And you have, on the other hand, on the other side, you have E198K that is significantly increasing it. So what seems to be happening here? Again, just to remind you, these were the 2 mutations that were also affecting very much the binding of the drug. So looking at dissociation constant, so dissociation constant is the concentration at which half of the alpha in the beta tubulin are bound, half of it are not bound at a specific temperature. But actually, you don't need to look at the whole value, but you only need to look at the concentration to see that E198K is actually, you only need less of it to achieve equilibrium, meaning the attraction is more and the binding is more specific, even compared it to the wild type. And in the opposite side, you have Q134H, meaning you need it's negative 11, meaning you need more concentration of it to achieve equilibrium, meaning the binding is more specific. Now, looking at again, we need to do the dynamics. For this method, we used the 50 nanoseconds, and it's quite similar. It shows there's no marked impact on tubulin structure. Essentially, the structure is very similar, it's very stable, but there's something happening with the binding of the drug. Now, the question is why? One of my committee members previously mentioned this. Why? Why is this happening? If the mutation is inside the protein, why is the interacting portion of the beta tubulin affected if the mutation is somewhere here inside? So just for background, the beta tubulin protein, these are the parts of the beta tubulin protein that interact with the alpha tubulin. So this group. Now, to look at what is different, so we compare the wild type and the two mutations, so Q134H and E198K. So as you can see, the RMSD of Q134H is very high compared to the wild type. So there's a bigger difference when you compare it to E198K. The RMSD is lower, RMSD is higher in Q134H. So the Q134H mutation caused a shift, shift in conformation in the interacting segments of the beta tubulin protein, resulting in negative and reducing the binding energy. Whereas the E198K, it's closely resembling the wild type. Perhaps that is the reason why it is increased in binding energy. So another way of looking at it is looking at this diagram. You can simply look at the blue one, the number of hydrogen bonds, and you will clearly see that for the reduced binding energy caused by Q134H, there's also a reduction in number of hydrogen bonds. So compared to 21 in wild type, 23 increase in E198K, hence the increase in binding energy. So because of this shift in conformation, the interaction between the alpha and the beta tubulin also changed, and resulting in favorable or more increased binding for E198K or more decreased binding for Q134H. So in conclusion, we found that certain mutations can strengthen or weaken the tubulin dimerization. So for instance, you have E198K, it can result in stronger and more stable dimerization, which we hypothesized or we discussed as it could be a possible additional mechanism of resistance, because the beta tubulin and therefore the microtubule could be more stronger. Whereas you have a scenario in Q134H where it could be that the dimer is less stable and is therefore weaker. So it can cause resistance, but it can also cause the death of the parasite. So because unstable microtubule. So we were able to publish this result also last December. And interestingly, it's already starting to get some citations. And one citation from it said that our results is quite interesting. And it's the first time they read that this phenomenon is occurring with regards to helminth beta tubulin. So that seems to be interesting. So last segment, last two chapters. So for this, the simple question we wanted to ask for this is, does this occur in hookworms in Southeast Asia? Does the mutations occur in hookworms in Southeast Asia? But before we go there, I wanted to ask myself, do I really need to do it? Do I really need to get sample and check it? So is there a need for it? Or another way of saying it is there any reports of reduced efficacy? So if there is reports, so there's a need to do it. If there's not, then why do it at all? So to answer these two questions, we did another systematic review, a much larger one. So drug-based control of STH infections in Southeast Asia. So for this systematic review, we wanted to know 4 things. So what countries conducted drug-based or MDA against STH for that particular time period? What were the treatment outcomes? So is it effective? Were the treatment effective or not effective? What the drugs they were using? So are they using benzimidazole or other things? And is there any indication of diminished efficacy? So for this, as I've said, this is a larger systematic review. So we were able to, at the end of the search process, we had more than 4,000 papers. So through a very long process, thank you a lot to all our collaborators, we're able to narrow it down to 27. So from the 27 papers, we found that among the countries in Southeast Asia, so Southeast Asia as in ASEAN countries, because WHO has a different definition of Southeast Asia, but what we mean here is the ASEAN countries. So among the countries, you have Lao PDR, have the highest number of papers, so 6, followed by Myanmar, Indonesia, Philippines, and East Timor, 4, 4, and 3, and 2 papers from Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and 1 paper from Malaysia. So no papers from Singapore and Brunei, obviously, because there's no infection there. So for the population that they were studying, majority were studying the entire community, not just the children, but the entire community. And for the types of studies, there were different types of studies that they were using. But going back to our research question, so what drugs were they using? So we found that benzimidazoles are still the king. They are still the #1 choice for treatment and control of STH. So a lot of the studies among the different species of STH were using albendazole or mebendazole. But an interesting phenomenon is they are already starting to do like the combination drugs, which I will discuss later on. But the point here is benzimidazole is still the most commonly used. So question number 3, is there a report of reduced efficacy? Yes, there is. For example, I highlight 2 papers here. From first, we can discuss the from Basneri, so which was conducted in Timor-Leste. So what they did was they administered albendazole at this dose, which is the recommended dose, and look at the cure rate, CR, and egg reduction rate after the treatment. And they found that for the human hookworm, the egg reduction rate is less than 90. So it should be, for the WHO, for the drug to be effective, it should be more than 90. But they found that it is less than 90, so indicating reduced efficacy. For Ascaris, it's 95, but it's in the borderline. But here comes this paper from Myanmar. So again, this is a different trichuris, different parasite, still STH. As their title implied, despite the many treatment of MDA with albendazole, the prevalence is not going down. So there's reports of reduced efficacy already. And I mentioned earlier the combination of the drug. So a lot of research specifically from the Swiss Tropmed group, they were collaborating with different countries and they were testing albendazole plus ivermectin. So ivermectin is another antihelmintic, but different mechanism from benzimidazole drugs. So they combine it. So for the intervention arm, they were using the ABC plus IVM, but for control, albendazole only. And you look at the egg reduction rate for the intervention arm, so the combination, almost 99%, which is great. So if we have, for instance, if we have resistant hookworm, we can use this combination. But at this point in time, it's still very early, undergoing several trials, but not yet recommended by the WHO. But going back to hookworms, since it's my parasite of interest, a recent paper from Dr. Vito Colella, which is from Melbourne, and with Ajahn Birak from Cambodia, Looking at the egg reduction rate, so they were using qPCR, so they were using the CT score as a measure of intensity of infection. So using that value, they were able to calculate the egg reduction rate, geometric mean and arithmetic mean, so just two methods of doing it. But still, both values are below 90%, way below 90%, 83 and 72. So indicating that in the population that they were studying, the hookworms and for this particular population is already like reduced efficacy to albendazole. So there's already report in Cambodia. So from this paper, we learned that benzimidazole resistance can threaten STH infection control in Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, 1 out of 10 have STH. That's the current like prevalence rate in the region. So almost all the countries have like the drug treatment program, and most of them use albendazole. Most of them use mebendazole. So if the worms are resistant to the mebendazole, what are we going to do? So monotherapy with benzimidazole drugs is gonna be like threatened or reduced efficacy. There is an opportunity for combination drugs, so albendazole, mebendazole, albendazole, and ivermectin, but again, it's still very early and not yet recommended. And moreover, with regards to my study, there's already reports in hookworms, so that's very alarming. So this paper is already under review in PLOS NTD, and we are hopeful that in the coming months, we'll get the review and have it published very soon. So last part. So the lesson so far for my PhD is that there's a need to revisit the efficacy of benzimidazoles, specifically with regards to or within the background of resistance. So chapter 5, last result chapter. So we titled it Novel BZ Resistance Associated Mutation in the Beta-tubulin Gene of Hookworm, of Zoonotic hookworm from Southeast Asia. So you will know why later, why we said it is novel and why is it important to highlight that it is zoonotic. So for this research, we have two main objectives. We wanted to simply detect if there's any mutation from hookworm samples from Southeast Asia. Moreover, since we detected a new mutation, we wanted to know what would be the in silico effects, because we already did it in the previous mutations that we found from systematic review. So we wanted to know, we did the same method actually to determine the resistance effect. So what we did was we asked samples from the Philippines and Indonesia. We identified the species. Then we amplified in sequence specific segments of the beta-tubulin gene where the mutation occurs. So again, we did the systematic review, the first systematic review. So we already know which parts of the beta-tubulin protein the resistance occurs. So we target that, submit it for sequencing. And for the use of the leftover sample, we had ethics clearance, of course, from KKU, and we had some funding support from the Faculty of Medicine. So this is the pipeline of our NGS analysis. So to sum it all up, we wanted to, basically this is a SNP detection pipeline, and the end goal is we wanted to know from the BCF, the filtered BCF, if there is SNP or single nucleotide changes that result in amino acid shift. So we will, at the end point, we will be able to get the mutated beta-tubulin gene if the mutation is present. So as I have mentioned, we did the similar in silico analysis from study 2 and study 3. And since we already have the results for the two mutation that cause resistance, so we just compare the new resistance, the new mutation to these two previously mentioned mutation. So for our results, we had a very limited number of samples because of due to ethics issues. I can discuss later on, but for now, I just like to say that we have very limited samples due to some ethical issues that I can discuss later on. But anyways, we identified two species, Ancylostoma ceylanicum and Negator americanus, and we were also able to amplify and sequence the gene targets that we wanted to see. So for A. ceylanicum, we have 3 samples. And we did not find any mutation. No. Not find any mutation at 134, 167, 198, 200. That the four regions that, or the four positions that we previously saw in the first systematic review, the common mutations. So, however, down the line we checked and we found that at position 237, 236 actually, sorry, that's a typo. So the GTC, which codes for valine, becomes ATC. So as you can see here at the bottom, and as requested by Ajahn Apina, this is like the first part of the BAM file, the alignment file. So A, this is supposed to be G. Yeah. So there's a mutation. There's a lot more down below, and this is the allele frequency. So for N Americanus, we didn't find anything in on the filtered BCF file. All were like wild type, similar to wild type. So no mutations were reported. So what do we know about the V236I mutation? So amino acid position 236 is within the binding site. So we know that, as you can see here in the docking method, in the molecular docking, both valine and isoleucine, the mutant and the wild type, the wild type and the mutant rather, are occurring in the binding site and they are exerting weak van der Waals interaction. So it's not directly interacting or forming a bond with the drug. But looking at similarly looking at the molecular dynamics, the RMSD, RMSF, and SASA, as I previously mentioned, movement, stability, protein flexibility, and exposed surface area are quite similar with the wild type, looking at the different values. Although there are slightly differences, for instance, increased flexibility here, but the overall structure of the protein is not changed with the presence of the V236I mutation. So the protein is intact. But then again, looking at the interaction between the protein and the drug, you clearly see that based on two methods again, both of them are showing that there is reduced binding efficacy and there reduced binding energy compared to wild type. So wild type is stronger, but the three mutation, including the V236I, are causing reduced binding energy. And in a similar fashion to previously reported, the reduction in binding energy is due to reduction in number of hydrogen bonds. I will say later on why this is happening. So what does it affect tubulin dimerization? And the answer is, from the structural perspective, not so much. The structure and dynamic behavior is very, very similar again. But how about the interaction between the alpha and the beta tubulin? Still, the value it slightly increased, but it's still quite similar with the wild type. And even the dissociation constant is showing it. Both of them are negative 11, e to the negative 11. So why is happening? Why is this happening? Why is there reduced efficacy in binding or reduced binding energy? So we need to look at again at the structure of the structure of the amino acid. So valine, both valine and isoleucine they're nonpolar, so their chemical characteristics is quite similar. But from the structural standpoint, isoleucine is bigger. The sec-butyl R group of isoleucine is bigger than the isopropyl R group of valine. So we hypothesized, or we thought, that the bigger R group of isoleucine is pushing the drug away from the optimum binding site, so causing steric hindrance in chemistry. So to prove this, we look at the binding site area and binding site volume, and we can see that although slight decrease, but there's already a decrease in binding site volume, indicating that indeed the bigger R group is pushing the drug. For the discussion, there's an interesting, in the first part of my presentation, I highlighted that there's a growing body of literature with regards to this mutation, specifically among hookworms. And among the results from those literature is the reports of many new mutations. So, for example, Q134H, which was is a new mutation just reported in 2021. So they are saying again that it's occurring in like high allele. It's not MAF anymore, but it's like not minor allele, but major allele frequency. As you can see here, there are several samples that the mutation is the 100%. The wild type is not already it's not the mutation, as you can see here. And it's the same is occurring. This is from dog hookworm in the US and Canada. This is from Australia and New Zealand. Again, no report of this in Asia, but basically, from what I'm gathering, it's showing that the worm is trying to diversify its beta tubulin. Moreover, that's for animal, Ajan. What about humans? This report by George et al. This is from Ghana, human hookworm. They reported several new mutations. There's no new 236I there. New mutations, and you can look at the frequency, allele frequency, from less than 1% to up to 67%. So from what I'm gathering from these reports, the worms are trying to diversify their beta tubulin protein. And if you can remember that the genome study earlier, the genome 1 is diversified in the Haemonchus. So the worms are trying to diversify because the FST or the diversity indices are going up compared to the non-resistant worms. So they're trying to fight the resistant. They're trying to resist the treatment through mutations. And going back to One Health, A. ceylanicum is a zoonotic worm. In Southeast Asia, it's number 2 in prevalence in humans, number 1 in dogs and cats. The reason why it is number 2 in humans is that we are treating Necator in humans, but we are not treating the dog hookworm. So the dog hookworm that is zoonotic can transfer to the humans. And we have, like for example, in Bangkok or in urban areas, families can treat their dogs, can go to the veterinarians and treat their dogs. So you have a scenario that the human population and the dog or the cat population is being dewormed, so selective pressure in both areas. So you can, there is a possibility that the zoonotic hookworm can receive pressure from both of the populations and therefore circulate between animals and humans, which could be a problem. So in conclusion, so we found a novel mutation from the zoonotic hookworm from the Philippines, from A. ceylanicum, and we have evidence that in silico, it can cause resistance. And the resistance is occurring because of the larger R group of the mutant amino acid, the mutant isoleucine. So what they say in conclusion, conclusion over conclusion. So in conclusion, the last conclusion, they say that a good PhD has to have a SOC, like not the sock in the foot, but SOCK. So significant original contribution to knowledge. So what is my SOC? So for my PhD, I have 4. So first, we were able to identify 7 mutations in the beta tubulin genome of hookworms related to resistance. We were able to unravel and determine how these mutations are causing resistance. So we answered that mystery. We were able to uncover that these mutations also affect the binding with the alpha tubulin and therefore affect the tubulin dimerization. And lastly, we were able to detect a novel mutation and we have evidence that it can cause resistance. So for future work, it would be interesting if we can, maybe for postdoc, if I can find a lab wherein I can test the B236I mutation. I can do it in vitro, so you can express the protein alpha and beta tubulin with the mutation and the wild type. Compare it to in the presence of the drug, if it polymerize like this, meaning it causes resistance. If it doesn't polymerize, so it's not causing resistance. in vivo, you can also the worm itself, edit the worm itself, and follow what Diels et al. Did. Gene edit the worm, contain the resistance, then expose to the drug to see if they can resist or not. Be an interesting future work. And I think the take-home lesson for my research is that benzimidazole resistance is a threat for control and elimination efforts of STH. And we need more research, perhaps research in drug discovery, perhaps research in detecting the mutations. But the point is, benzimidazole resistance can threaten STH control and elimination, which we are targeting in 2030. I do not know if we can achieve that by 2030, but we are hopeful that we can. So to end, in my PhD, as Ajahn Sutta mentioned earlier, I have several papers published. So papers 1 to 5 are already out there. It's already published. You can check it. And we have one paper under review and one paper to be prepared and to be submitted. So I have enjoyed I enjoyed my time here in Conken. So I have participated. My advisors are very encouraging in me participating in conferences. So I've won some awards in some of these conferences. And earlier this year, like I won like a very good award from the 3-minute thesis competition, which is very cool. But to end, thank you very much to all of you for attending the presentation today. Thank you to my advisors, of course, for their never-ending support. Thank you to Ajahn Apiña and Ajahn Panupong for they are examining committee, but they are like advisory committee as well, because they help me narrow down the methods. And to friends who helped, so Heiko, Alok, Prao, and Ajahn Suitra, and everyone. So thank you very much. And I'm now ready to answer some questions, some clarifications if you have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, for your interesting presentation. I think, do you need a short time for break before you answer the question? Or you are ready now for the question from the floor? You need a break, right?
I'm okay, Ajahn. We can proceed.
Okay. So, if anyone have a question to ask Chris, so please welcome ask him any question, please.
Yes, you can. Any questions? You can type it on the chat box, or you can raise your hand and speak in the conference. Both are okay.